안녕하세요. I hope I said that correctly. Okay, good. Hello, everyone. My name is Stacey Yount, and I'm Medidata's Vice President for Clinical Trial Management Systems and Risk-Based Monitoring. And I'm here to talk to you today about a paradigm shift for CTMS. CTMS is in place to give oversight to clinical trials, for clinical trial oversight. And the paradigm shift that we're going to talk to you about today has to do with the growing complexity of clinical trials and how a CTMS needs to be fundamentally different in order to stay ahead of that complexity. But before we get into the talk, I thought I'd share a little bit about myself. I've worked in the pharma industry now for more than 20 years. I started when I was 12. And I worked at Eli Lilly and Company, Covance, and now Medidata. I got my start as a CRA. Do I have anybody out there in the audience who was a CRA at any point in time? Anybody? How about a data manager? I was a data manager too. And then I worked in statistics for many years. And then through the years, I've also been in leadership roles in those different areas, as well as being at Medidata now in technology. So my point of view comes from a lot of different functional areas. And what I've seen over the last 20 years is what you've all seen in your careers, and that's constant change and constant growing complexity. But that's nothing like what we've all seen and experienced over the last 5 years. Complexity has gotten to a point now where clinical trial oversight has never been harder. And that's really what we're going to talk about in this paradigm shift. And it's actually a pretty simple concept. It's the connection or the relationship between complexity or growing expectations on a clinical trial and the amount of effort that we have to put in place to continue overseeing those clinical trials. So it's a balance between the two. And what we've seen is that as expectations increase, what do? Our effort has to increase, right, to continue overseeing studies. For a CTMS, this is the same thing. For clinical trial management systems, every time something changes, we make a modification in our CTMS to try to stay ahead of the change. The issue is that we're focusing on something that's never going to stabilize, and that's complexity. There was a recent article last year. It was an updated research by Tufts Institute, and it was looking at clinical trial complexity. There's a lot of data out there that we've all probably seen most of it, but the Tufts article was the most recent one. And what they showed is that over the last 4 to 5 years, there's been an 86% increase in the number of endpoints in a clinical trial. In that same time period, there's been an increase of 63% of the number of investigator sites for a given clinical trial. That's just in the last 4 to 5 years. There also is some recent research from the Society of Clinical Research Sites that has shown that an individual clinical research site that's managing one study has to operate 12 different systems to work in that study. It's really fascinating and out of control for complexity. And the result that we all deal with every day is an exponential growth in the amount of data that we have on our studies. And I was shocked to see this, and that is that in the last few years, we've seen a 50% increase in the amount of data on studies. If you were in the session just before this that Andrew Gebbe was hosting, in that session he gave you a lot of examples of new types of data like wearable devices and patient-centric data. All of that has resulted in an increase in the amount of data that we have on studies. So as these things increase, as the amount of complexity grows, what do? We grow with it. So we add another tracker, we add another spreadsheet, we modify our dashboards, and each time something shifts or changes, we put more effort or work in place. And the issue with that is that we never seem to catch up. We're always chasing it, right? And because of this, we've actually decided from Medidata's standpoint that existing CTMS technologies and the way we use them in this method of continuing to grow and change is just simply not scalable. The problem is that we believe that we've been focusing on the wrong issue. we have been focusing on a tracking problem. If we can just build the right spreadsheet, if we can design the right dashboard, if we can share the right tracker, we'll finally be able to stay ahead of the curve. But the problem is that we actually don't know what that next expectation is going to be, and it's always got a negative impact each time. So it impacts the number of resources that we need to oversee the study. It impacts our timelines. We're slower at developing and overseeing clinical trials today than we were 10 years ago. And it also negatively impacts our study budgets and our overall profitability. And like I said earlier, even with all of that, we still don't know what that next change is going to be. And when it comes into place, it may be something that we're not ready for. This means that the model we've had in place for clinical trial oversight is simply unsustainable and unscalable. And on top of that, we believe it's unstable. What we're putting in place is a new paradigm for CTMS, and that's what we're terming intelligent oversight, which is the ability to oversee clinical trials in a significantly different way today. It involves 3 core elements, and those are context, the ability to cut through the noise on a study and see what's happening. It involves collaborating across matrix and functions and companies to work together on a study. And it involves remediating early and taking actions to decrease the risk and to ensure that you remediate what's happening early on in your study. These 3 core components we're going to talk about throughout the course of this presentation: context, collaboration, and remediation. But put together in intelligent oversight, we now are starting to see that our studies can be overseen. We're able to manage them within CTMS with fewer resources. We're able to see our timelines positively impacted and have better control of our study budgets and overall be more profitable as companies. That's really the core to what we're putting in place. So what we want to be able to do is to provide a model that stabilizes and is ahead of the curve so that you're no longer chasing the changes, but you're actually able to leverage your technology to drive change. So let's talk about those 3 core components of intelligent oversight. The first one that you see up here is about context. Context is really simple. It's about cutting through all of the noise on your clinical trial to see what's really happening. I don't know about all of you, but I've often, working in studies, been overwhelmed at the amount of information coming at me. And often the information is late, it's outdated, or it's inaccurate. What we've built is a platform so that as data comes in, it automatically flows downstream into context and shows you what's really happening so that you know where the problems are on your study. The second core component is collaboration. I know when I started working, and this is going to probably show my age, but when I was first a CRA working with investigator site, what I experienced at that time is that when we were running a large global study, most of the functional teams, like data management, clinical operations, they were all in the same company. They also were mainly in the same region, or maybe 2 regions, but typically the same company. You fast forward today, and our functional areas are larger in number. Many times we have multiple functions that are outsourced to different CROs, and sometimes we even have drugs that are being developed by 2 different sponsors. So the study teams are now located globally in a matrixed organization, and you sometimes and oftentimes have study team members that are never actually speaking to one another in a live manner throughout the course of the study. That's critical, right? And it creates a lot of problems. What we've designed is a platform where you're collaborating all within the same system to be able to work together and look at the same context that's accurate and near real time. And then lastly, when you have these 2 things, so you're able to cut through the noise on your study through context, and you're able to collaborate in a matrixed organization, it enables you to remediate early. So you're able to take decisions and actions when issues first evolve, and that way you're able to ensure that they don't have a dramatic impact on the outcome of your study. And Andrew gave you a few examples where that's happening, and it's quite powerful. So all of these three things together are really how you transform clinical operations into organizations that are driving change and building change rather than chasing it. And that's the difference with the concept of intelligent oversight. So now let's talk a little bit more about our CTMS and some of the tactical or individual elements of it. Every time we've implemented CTMSs in the last 15 years for every company, and I'm sure you're from many different sponsors and CROs, when you've implemented CTMSs in the past, a core requirement has been that that drives efficiency in your company. Well, since we've operated from a standpoint where we're managing through spreadsheets and trackers and dashboards and very complicated ways to manage a study, it's not hard to build efficiencies in. We believe that efficiency should be an absolute given and an expectation. And when you implement the four main components of our CTMS, those efficiencies come with it. And those elements that you see here are within study administration and master data. And the second one is enrollment and milestone tracking. And then we have deviation and issue management, as well as site management. Those are the common elements we all know and are familiar with for CTMS. And when you implement those, you're going to drive efficiency that we'll talk about later in the presentation. But we think the big difference is not just the efficiency, but when you implement these four things within the metadata platform that you've heard a lot about today, you should have effortless, easy access to those three elements that make you more effective and better at what you do: context, collaboration, and remediation. You don't have to implement those parts of the CTMS. They're automatic and they come with the basic implementations of those four elements. So let's talk more then about the intelligent oversight piece when it comes to what the true differences are. So I talked to you about the concepts. Now let's make it real and talk about what you really get when you implement this. The first piece that you see there is one source of truth. I hope you've heard this concept a few times throughout the day today, and that is one source of truth on the platform so that you set up your studies once, you enter the data once, and then you're done with it. You don't have to enter the same information multiple times. In addition to that, you're able to leverage multiple data sources. And just in the prior presentation before mine, we talked about several of those data sources, but there are many, many more well outside of the metadata platform. It may even be systems that you're using outside of our platform, but being able to ingest and use that data, that's part of what we're building in this system. And then the third part on there that we talked a lot about is breaking down silos, and I'm sure you probably understand that well by now, but that's collaborating across teams, and then also letting the data work for you, which is really what we're going to talk about here. So letting the data work for you is about taking things that we've been doing for years in multiple systems and starting to flow that information downstream. So in this graphic, what you can see is that you have data on the left-hand side. Those are different data sources. And we've had a lot of focus in the industry on big data, in all industries actually. You know, big data has become very cool, right? The problem with data is that no matter how much of it you have, in and of itself, by itself, it's meaningless. It's not until you create something out of the data that it really has meaning and value. And what we've done on the platform is to take those data sources and ensure that that information flows downstream through our platform and is output in context and actions and documents and different work that you have to do as a team. So it's taking that data and having it work for you rather than you continuing to re-enter and re-enter the same information. We're going to talk about one of these examples now, and it's the first one on here, and it's the monitoring visit report. I'm going to share with you an example that goes through all three elements or all three pillars that we discussed within the CTMS, and we'll go from the first patient visit and the time those patients are seen all the way through the development of the monitoring visit report. So you see how this data flow happens and how data is really turned into context. Okay? So let's look at the next slide for that. So the first element that we talked about was context. And the key philosophy or strategy around this is making sure your teams can work smarter. And in this situation, we have a clinical trial manager, and that clinical trial manager is overseeing her study early on. She wants to make sure she finds issues with the sites and the patients early on in the study so that they don't get out of control. And in this example, we have some patients that are being seen at the study site, and that data is entered in at the site. Once the data is entered in the site, we have near real-time access to it in context. So data is entered into the EDC, whether that's Medidata's EDC or another EDC, and we flow that through so that then you'll be able to have access to the context, which comes out in the form of different insights like enrollment rate and screen failure rate and other types of insights and dashboards and visualizations. So in this situation, the clinical trial manager starts to see that there's a problem emerging at the beginning of the study. And she sees that when she looks at the screen failure rate, which is there at the top middle. She sees that the screen failure rate is higher than she would expect. That's all about context, quickly being able to see problems. So let's now move on to collaboration. She sees a problem emerge with screen failure rate. So she decides to collaborate and triage that issue with the other members of her study team. She starts with the monitor, the site monitor, and she creates an issue in issue management. And she lets the monitor know that there's a possible problem at the site with enrollment and with possibly with the screen failure rate at that site, meaning too many patients are not getting into the clinical trial. The monitor looks at it, and she's not quite sure what's going on, and she doesn't have enough information to actually take an action at the site. So she shares the issue, and she escalates the issue to the medical monitor because she wants a medical viewpoint to see what might be happening at the site. And in this example, the medical monitor very quickly looks at it and says that they believe that there's a problem with the site understanding inclusion-exclusion criteria. So that same issue is then routed back to the monitor at the site to go retrain the site on understanding of inclusion-exclusion criteria at the protocol. So in this example for collaboration, an issue started with one individual, went to the monitor for the site, and then to the medical monitor and then back, all to collaborate in a virtual workspace and all to collaborate on one virtual page together. At the end of the day, the medical monitor is giving the advice that the site needs to be retrained, which moves us on then to remediation. So now the site monitor is preparing for the site visit to go out and retrain on inclusion-exclusion criteria. And that individual then goes out and retrains the site, verifies that there was a misunderstanding, that they didn't fully understand the protocol, but now they do because they've been retrained. So she closes out the issue in issue management, documents the actions that she's taken, and that closes the loop for documentation for that issue. Then at the end of the day, she's exhausted, right? Because she's put in a lot of work over the last few days to try to figure out what this problem is, and she's still got to create all of her documentation for a monitoring visit report and her site letter. Well, there's good news because all of that work that she's been doing, as well as the data that's been entered by the site, is going to flow downstream into the monitoring visit report and populate for her. So that all she has left to do is to finish out any of the new data that hasn't been entered yet and finish the monitoring visit report, close out the site letter, and she's done. This is what I meant by data working for you. This is about putting data to work for you and being more effective on your studies. So at the end of the day, we were able to remediate a problem that could have gone on longer and could have resulted in us missing more and more patients on this study. So it's a great example of early remediation. That's really intelligent oversight. And that's when we say on here transformation, I mean, that's truly what it's all about. It's about enabling you through technology to transform the way you do work. So that's the difference when you're implementing the CTMS. And I want to quickly remind you, or go back to the same slide we talked about earlier when we were discussing the tactical or the true benefits of the system. Thinking about that example that we walked through, you can probably now relate to these 4 elements on here. There were real ways in which one source of truth was used because data wasn't entered multiple times, right? There were tangible ways where we were leveraging different data sources to turn it into context. We definitely were breaking down silos by collaborating across those functional areas. And then at the end of the day, we took the data that had been entered and we used it as insights so that we could remediate early, creating value very early on in the study. That's really the difference. And it also is powered then by the metadata platform that you heard Glenn DeVries and several other people talk about earlier today. So I hope these themes are starting to be very common for you. But the platform for CTMS, when you look on here in that light blue box that says RAVE, CTMS is part of the RAVE family. And it's all driven by the same elements that were discussed in other presentations around platform unification. A couple of the other elements that are in that RAVE family that you may be interested in hearing about, or maybe something that's on your mind that are related to CTMS, those 2 elements are risk-based monitoring and also electronic trial master file. And the reason why many times these 3 things go together, CTMS, RBM, and trial master file, is they relate to the same functional areas. They're very similar workflows and sometimes the same workflow. And when done separately, there's a lot of redundancy across the 3. So I'm going to share with you some examples or some explanation of risk-based monitoring and eTMF right now and how those relate to some of the CTMS concepts that we talked about. So the first one is risk-based monitoring. The difference in risk-based monitoring that we've taken is that we've kind of turned the paradigm upside down. You know, the traditional paradigm is to focus very intently on critical data. Identifying your critical data, then identifying all of the possible risks that might go along with that data, creating tons of mitigation on top of it. And what we've heard from different sponsors and CROs is that the processes we put in place in the industry for risk-based monitoring are just a mess right now. They're very complicated. And we believe they're complicated because we've looked at them wrong. So we've turned it upside down, and we're starting with the risk assessment to very simply build a risk assessment system that then, just like we talked about for the CTMS, the risk assessment starts to drive downstream process. So the risk assessment helps you manage your issues. The risk assessment helps you identify your key risk indicators and your monitoring strategies. And your risk-based monitoring strategy is then built around the risks of the study, the core risks, those that are most important. And lastly on here you see machine learning. And machine learning you're going to hear about in the next presentation that's being given by Young, and it's around centralized statistical analytics. And in this paradigm where we've turned it upside down, we've started with the risk assessment, and through the risk assessment, decided what it is that we want to look at and focus our time. And then the rest of the focus of data review should actually be guided by the data itself. And that's where machine learning's coming into play, and that's what you'll hear about in the next presentation. But in this situation where we've turned things upside down, the result is that we're very quickly able to get to risks early in the study. And again, that should sound familiar to what we talked about from the CTMS. So we've got context, and we've got collaboration, and we've got remediation, all being a central focus for risk-based monitoring as well. And the technologies, CTMS and RBM, are unified together. So that as you're implementing your CTMS technology, you can implement that by itself, or you can decide to implement it with risk-based monitoring. So you can implement either one of them alone, or you can start to implement them together. But it's just a simple upgrade to move from one to the other, because you've already done the hard work the first time you did an implementation. So that's really the risk-based monitoring difference. And we can talk about that at a break, or you can also come by some of the demo booths to look at some of the technologies within CTMS and RBM. But the last one that I want to look at here is eTMF now, so electronic trial master file. Historically, the CTMS and the eTMF have been separate, right? And as a result, when you create, review, and approve a document in CTMS, you then have to download it, then sign it into your eTMF, upload it into your eTMF, and oftentimes then route it for approval and storage again, resulting in a ton of overlap and redundancies between those two systems. So as we've been building out a platform version of eTMF, what we're building is something that integrates or unifies in with CTMS, so that when you create your monitoring visit report or other documents in your CTMS, route those for approval, they're automatically then routed to your eTMF, and those approvals stay in your eTMF, and you also are able to leverage standard reference models as well in eTMF in an automated fashion. So that's the unification and some really good examples of how it works in our system or in our platform. I said earlier that I wouldn't forget about efficiency. You know, we talked a lot about effectiveness, but we still need to think about return on investment. So when you implement our systems, what kind of benefits do you get, and what do you actually get to do faster or better as a result? So I wanted to provide 3 examples for you. And these deal with implementing the eTMF on the left, eTMF and CTMF on the left too. And then the right one deals with implementing the CTMS for monitoring visit reports. The first one is a 90% reduction in QC. That's because when you implement the eTMF and CTMF together, you have those redundancy savings that I talked about in the prior slide. So it's a really substantial decrease in the amount of quality control work that you have to do. Then also, the CRAs are saving a significant amount of time between the reconciliation of the site file, the investigator site file, and the eTMF, because those redundancies no longer exist. So those are significant savings. The last one on there is a reminder of what we talked about earlier when we walked through those 3 elements of a CTMF: context, collaboration, and remediation. And in that example that I shared, you're actually saving 70% of time because of the data that is flowing through into context and into downstream work. So that's a significant saving on the part of the CRA. And that's a great example of how you can be the sponsor of choice, like Andrew was talking about in the prior presentation. So those are great savings overall and truly show the power of implementing the CTMS. So this is all about leveraging the platform, and it's about whether or not you implement just one piece, like the CTMS, or you start to implement across the platform in multiple areas, you're going to see efficiency and you're going to see greater effectiveness. I'd love to see some of you come out and look at demos. We have the CTMS booth out there, and we can help dive into some of these details. But I really appreciate you inviting me here. Kamsahamnida? Is that correct? Thank you.